All right, we'll get the session started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. A packed room for a discussion on EU reform. Times really are changing. We'll welcome to the session on the European Union, the decision maker, here at the Bled Strategic Forum. My name is Jörn Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, a foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C. And it's great to be back in Bled. Always a great turnout. Thank you for the organizers for putting together excellent series of convenings. And I'm looking forward to moderating today's conversation. We're here to discuss EU reform at a time of strategic shocks and new geopolitical realities. I think anyone following the opening sessions yesterday, especially with the Prime Minister of Slovenia and Council President Charles Michel, realizes that those conversations, those keynotes really set the stage for our discussion today in many, many ways. There's a heavy focus on enlargement, the recognition that enlargement really has regained new urgency and momentum as Europe is responding to Russia's war in Ukraine. And looking at enlargement with a new sense of urgency as an essential tool for bolstering European security, stability, and ultimately, hopefully, peace on the continent. I think the news that stood out yesterday was President Michel's suggestion of a sort of loose target date for the European Union to get ready for large enlargement, especially for Ukraine, but also the Western Balkans. And that brings us right to our discussion today on EU reform, the EU getting ready for enlargement. Because with that new momentum on enlargement, we've also seen a new urgency on EU reform, preparing an EU the EU and its internal processes and foundations for a membership of 30, 32, 35 even. And while there's growing consensus on the need for reform and making, as one of our panelists put it in her contribution to the Bled Strategic Times, making the EU fit for 35 in reference to the Green Transition program. There's little agreement yet on the nature, the scope, and the approaches to reform, maybe. Maybe my panelists will prove me wrong on that. We have a great panel, quite a large panel, and lots of ground to cover and very little time. So I hope we can have as much of a conversation here and explore with a great cross-section of member states and experts the thinking on potential EU reform. And so I want to dive right in. I'll run us through quick introductions and then, without sticking to protocol, go to individual panelists. And hopefully we will also have time for some questions from the audience and look forward to engaging all of you as well. Starting on my left, we have Marko Štucin, the State Secretary for European Affairs, International Law, and the Protection of Interests of the State for Slovenia. Welcome. We have Minister Laurence Boone, Minister of State for European Affairs of the French Republic. We have Daniela Schwarzer, member of the Executive Board of the Bertelsmann Foundation. I have on my left Gordan, Grlić, Radman, the Minister of Foreign and EU Affairs for Croatia, Minister Péter Szijjártó, Foreign Minister, a Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, to be precise, for Hungary, Mariya Gabriel, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs for Bulgaria, Jessika Roswall. Minister for European Affairs for Sweden, fresh off the presidency. We'll come back to that. And then Tiago Antunes, the Portuguese Secretary of State for EU Affairs. Welcome, everyone. We'll dive right in. And I'll start with State Secretary Štucin. We heard yesterday from your Prime Minister in the opening about this real momentum, new momentum for enlargement, a real push behind this, and the link to necessary reform. And he essentially said, we'll see EU reform in the next 12 months, either in the next 12 months or not for a long time. As we look at major decisions in the fall, as we look at the political transition elections next year, if we really are on that timeline, plus minus, how are you looking at priorities for EU reform from a Slovenian perspective?
Thank you very much, and in the name of host country, warm welcome to Bled. Sorry for the weather. If there's, should get used to it. If there's one positive side about it, is that this room is full. Last year, I remember the weather was better, and everybody was walking around the lake. So. But maybe it's also full because we realize even more that the reform of the European Union is needed, what my Prime Minister said yesterday. Why the pressure? A couple of things are coming up. European elections are coming up. We'll have new Commission next year. We'll have new Parliament, European Parliament next year. 2025, we'll start negotiating new financial framework, which is really important start of a turn of events that will bring us to the question what we want from the European Union in the next decade. War in Ukraine started last year, and the war reminded us that we need to stick together. But also, the president of the European Council yesterday said in his speech, and he framed his speech around the world solidarity. If we see one value that is, emerging in our societies, in European societies, in our countries, is solidarity, which is, by the way, not listed in the values in the Lisbon Treaty, but it's something that we all notice. When something terrible happens, when the terrible floods happened in our country, we immediately saw solidarity of European member states, of European Union. When the war in Ukraine started, we saw the solidarity really bringing results, and we all are trying our best to help. And solidarity is also something that we could connect to reform, because what solidarity means, it means that we wish for our neighbors, for everybody in this club, to not be in troubles, to be better off. And when we are thinking about what kind of union we want in the next 10, 20 years, we need to think what we can do to make the union better and what we should do right away, right now. Now, there are a couple of misunderstandings about the reform. We don't need to reform to change the treaties right away. We have many things in the current treaties that we simply need to implement. So the reform is possible very fast. It's not. We don't need to go to the convention like with the Laken Declaration 2001 and then have the whole process of reform. We can just decide to do it better and faster and more efficient. And this is why we are meaning with this. We need to do it now. We need to, 10 years, the question is how this European Union will look like. It functions well right now, but as it is right now, it won't function good in 10 or 20 years' time. And that's why we need to act.
Thank you. Now, hopefully we'll get to a debate whether we need that fundamental reform or can have a more scaled down, more efficient process, maybe. I would like to move to Minister Boone and the French perspective here. You previously, earlier this summer, said there should be no more taboos when we talk EU reform. President Macron yesterday called for more audacious approach to EU integration against the backdrop of EU reform and enlargement. Can you walk us through, as you see this debate gathering momentum, about the French priorities, key components for you, and maybe as a part two question, you launched with your German counterparts a Franco-German working group on EU reform. Without giving away all of the secrets, because I know much of that is coming out later in September, but maybe I can tempt you to give us a preview of one or two things.
Thank you. First, thanks for the invitation. It's an immense pleasure to be back in Bled for the second time in a row, and it's an incredible sight to see how many people are here. I was already impressed last year with the night hall when the amount of people gathering, and I think it is a demonstration of how vibrant the last enlargement has made Europe. Because here now, it's indispensable to be every year to discuss the future and the strategic future of the EU. So thanks, and thanks to Marcos for being so kind as to having us. And you mentioned the president, and at the moment it is the annual ambassadors conference in Paris, and yet he wanted someone to be here because it is so important. I will come to what our challenges are, but I want to have a disclaimer first because you mentioned the Franco-German group of independent experts. The German side being represented here by Daniela, I wouldn't dare unveiling anything, and anyway, she's keeping me away from her work. So perhaps you can ask her that question on the preview. Okay, I think a couple of things. Why? I think what Russia's aggression against Ukraine is demonstrating, as well as the misinformation and disinformation that we have into all our neighborhood countries of the EU, is that there will be no security and stability for the EU and the neighborhood countries without enlargement. And I think that's as simple as that. If we want peace, security, and stability on the continent, we need this enlarged EU. We need it for the candidate countries, and we need it for the EU. And I was impressed by Marcos repeating solidarity. I think I'm going to repeat as well security and stability a number of times. That's the first thing. And the reason I mentioned values is twofold. We are the largest democratic region of the world with 440 million citizens in the EU. And we are directly threatened because we are a democracy, and because what is the most important for all of us is the rule of law. We are being threatened by what Russia is doing against Ukraine, by misinformation and disinformation. It's a humanitarian disaster for Ukraine, but it is also a very direct and deliberate intention to undermine us, our democracy, the rule of law, the way we're living, our prosperity, security, and stability. And for that reason, we need enlargement, and we need an enlargement with a political commitment from all of us that what gathers us together. It's that belief in the rule of law and democracy. And that's the premise of it. And then obviously, and I think Marko said it very well, and I'm sure when Daniela unveiled what she thinks, she will say it again. We're 27. We might be even more than 35. Hopefully as fast as possible. I know Charles Michel said 2030. Could be faster even. But what we need is to reform ourselves and for the candidate countries to be also reforming themselves. Now, we may not have done that very well in the past. and we may want to be a lot more involved and helpful and dynamic in this enlargement process to avoid any fatigue, to make the benefits of being a future EU member much more tangible to the candidate countries. And I think that is our duties, so that the enthusiasm we are seeing when Georgians wave the European flag lasts throughout the enlargement and the accession process. We also need to reform ourselves because, yes, we do manage to find solutions, always. But perhaps we could be quicker, perhaps we could be more efficient, perhaps it could be less costly, and it could be more dynamic. And I think we've made tremendous progress, but we can do a lot better. Look at how fast some of our competitors can move. And for this, what do we want? We will want to be leaders in Ukraine reconstruction. We want to be the leaders in climate transition, and we are. We want to keep or to grasp a leadership position in digital transition. We will need something that will look like a different budgetary policy than what we have today to actually underpin these actions. And in a way, you alluded to it with the revision of our budget. We need to change profoundly if we want to be that, especially at 35-37. So that's why we need to reform ourselves. And as Marcos was saying, we don't need, it's not about big convention or stuff like that. It's about the political objective that we want to achieve. That is what is the most important. And the last point I want to make on this, because you warned us that we would have very little time, is there is a huge window of opportunity. We have a favorable European Parliament. Might not be the case after the European election in June. We should keep that in mind. We have a geopolitical environment that is putting pressure on everyone, and that is something also we should do. And I think there is unity. We might have some differences, but we've always managed to keep this unity, and we should make the most of it now, before things change. Thank you.
Itself and the integration process, and then reminding us of the politics, obviously, with political transitions and elections coming next year. We'll come back to hopefully all of those points. I want to move to my right and to Deputy Prime Minister Mariya Gabriel of Bulgaria. Someone, we spoke just before the panel, someone who brings sort of a unique perspective here as a former commissioner, someone who sat in the parliament since elections were just mentioned, and now looks at this from a member state. How do you see the need of reform from Sofia with that vantage point there, but the experience from Brussels? And we talked about this a little bit. It'd be interesting to hear you share some of those thoughts.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be again in Bled. Well, I must say that I see the European experience, my experience as member of the European Parliament, as former commissioner, as something extremely helpful. But it's true that you learn from your experience in every institution. From the European Parliament, you learned this culture of dialogue, understanding, and cooperation. In the Commission, you can see that we are able to take bold actions. And in the Council, that's this delicate balance between national interests, but at the same time, we are leaders, we want to anticipate, and we want really to affirm the role of the European Union in the world. So I must say that that's for me the challenge, how we can combine the long-term unity with bold actions. And here, if you'd like to ask to this question, is the European Union a decision maker? And before arriving to the question of the technical details of the reforms, I think that we need answers. We need answers. The European Union is a decision maker for whom? For citizens, but in that case, we have to increase the sense of belonging. We need to make much more visible our European success stories. what are these examples? We have shown only in the last 3-4 years that we are able to take bold actions. Remember the COVID-19 and the pandemic, the Green Deal, first climate neutral continent by 2050, Russia's aggression, we stay united. We took actions, the diversification of energy sector. So I think that it's really important now to give a little bit more visibility to these success stories and especially to make them really useful to our citizens. And I very much hope here that's a message for young people, for that Erasmus Plus. It's one of those European success stories that we don't talk enough. So for me, it's one thing. And here maybe it's coming this idea of the progressive integration, because that can bring concrete benefits for citizens, for countries. And that's the link with my second point. Decision maker for citizens, yes, but for member states and the candidates. And here, for me, the challenge is how we can really have this sense of equal importance, how we can have the feeling of co-ownership of the decision-making. We have to address the fears of some of the countries. I'm very grateful that the working group is already addressing this, because it's true that enlargement is a driver of reforms, it's a driver of advancement, but it's true that EU should also be ready to act. We need to pay attention not to reinforce sometime this sentiment of second category of countries or citizens that some political forces are using in a perfect way. And with the disinformation, with all the hybrid threats, we have really to change even sometime our narrative and to innovate. I think that that's one of the key issues, that we need to innovate in our approach. And finally, yes, decision maker for the world, for our strategic partners. And here, yes, again, we need to work how we can promote this win-win partnership. What's about our strategic partners? What are our common goals? And at the heart of all this, for me, it's our shared values. We have fundamental principles, and that was already said. Democracy, human rights, fight against corruption. Here, we need to stay very, very much united. So again, inclusive approach, be bold, but at the same time preserve the unity. How we can advance by preserving this unity, I think that that's a real challenge. And before, again, entering into technical details, that sometimes we have to be aware our citizens don't want only this kind of debates. We have to transform our success stories and our concrete proposals in something that is tangible, concrete, and beneficial for our citizens. And here, I think that we have to pay a little bit more attention in the process. It's not only a decision that is with a top-down approach from the Council, from the Commission, from the European Parliament. They all have a role, but we have to involve much more our citizens. And here, yes, we have to involve much more our young people. We need their voice to be listened and to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that reminder of an inclusive conversation on EU reform, and also that balancing act that you described in terms of the long-term unity, but the efficiency of action on the other side. I want to move to my immediate right here, Minister Szijjártó. Hungary has been a sort of strong proponent for both more rapid enlargement, but also for strong member state competences in the European Union. As we look at a busy fall, key decisions on especially Ukrainian accession talks, this broader debate gathering speed, what are Hungary's priorities, and how are you addressing the key question of the need for reform with this positioning in mind?
Well, thank you so much. If you raise the question whether we are still a decision maker, then the answer is yes, obviously, we are a decision maker. If the question is being raised in a way that in what form is this decision maker, in what shape is this decision maker, then unfortunately, if we only base our answer on facts, then we have to say that this decision maker, namely the European Union, is in a bad shape currently. Why? Because we have lost a lot of power, a lot of strength in the recent years on three major areas. On security of the continent, no question, on our economic weight regarding the global economy, and our energy security. Three major areas. And the fact that we have lost strength and power is not coming from scratch. This is a consequence of decisions which we should have not made or should have made differently, or decisions which we have missed and we should have made. So if you allow me, with an initiative to describe and not to judge, just sticking to some facts. When it comes to security, you know, I'm coming from a country which is a neighbor to Ukraine. So the impacts of the war are critical on us. Not to speak about the fact that I'm representing a nation, members of which are dying in this war. And this gives us a very unique approach and angle in this regard. But I have to tell you that I have been sitting there among the European foreign ministers for 9 years now. I've even started earlier than Federica took over. And on all the meetings of the Foreign Affairs Council, when we have discussed a war or an armed conflict situation somewhere far away of us, the major approach of ours was that we have demanded the stakeholders of the given war or armed conflict to resolve this issue or that issue on a peaceful basis, to sit around the negotiating table and stop fighting. And unfortunately, when a war takes place on our own continent, we are not able to follow this approach of ours, because once you speak strongly about the need for immediate peace, ceasefire, peace talks, whatever, you are immediately being judged and stigmatized as a Russian spy and propagandist of Kremlin or a fan of Putin or whatever. So I think this is the first problem, that in the last 1.5 years, we have not been able to move forward towards creating peace on the continent, to the contrary. Second, the economy. We love to look at ourselves as a strong economic stakeholder of global economy. And that's why I love to be not only Minister of Foreign Affairs, but economic issues as well, because their facts and figures count at least. And in 2010, when it comes to the share from global GDP, we were taking the lead against China 22-9. Our share was 22% when it comes to global GDP. China's share was 9% in 2010. Now China is taking the lead 18-17 to Europe. Last year was the first year that the share of China when it comes to global GDP was higher than ours. And in this regard, I do think that we have not really found the right way when speaking about decoupling and de-risking, because I really do believe that the real risk is de-risking. The risk is not the cooperation with a quickly, rapidly emerging economy, but the risk is being decoupled from it. Therefore, we think that a more rational approach and a stronger cooperation on economic issues with China would be something that would help the European economy to grow. Third and last, on energy. I'm representing a country.
I can interrupt you.
Yeah, please, of course, you can. I'm used to it. I'm on CNN pretty often, so it was a wonder that I could speak like 4 minutes. So
I want to bring you back though to the question of reform.
Yeah, that's why I want to say why it needs to be reformed. Yeah.
But in terms of the, some of the categories we've already heard, I mean, these will impact Hungary in major ways, not just Hungary, but as one member state. So how are you thinking about the need for EU reform? We can have and we're having at Bled discussions about competitiveness, China and energy, but back to that core issue.
Yeah, and sure, I'm coming there. And the third issue is energy, where we unfortunately have not been able to consider energy as it is, a physical issue, but we have approached it in a dogmatic, political, and ideological way. We should have not done, because energy is always a matter of infrastructure and physics. So how we should reform? I do believe that the first major step should be to see how we can be bigger and stronger. And how we can be bigger and stronger? If there are more countries being as member states of the European Union. So I think here, enlargement is a must. Enlargement must be accelerated as much as it is possible. We heard 2030 yesterday. Fine, but why not tomorrow? So what keeps us away and back from saying that now we have to include all Western Balkan candidates into the European Union instead of waiting until 2030? Let's open all the chapters. It has a very bad track record in the recent years because we have not been able to open chapters with the candidates in the recent years. We have to open the chapters, and we have to close them as soon as possible. We have to include the Western Balkans, and with the Western Balkans, we will be bigger. We will be stronger. There will be a much bigger economic room for economic cooperation. From energy security perspective, they are the most important transit area currently, at least to the central part of Europe. And then it will be totally unnecessary. It will be totally unnecessary to cry about the initiative or the intention of others to be involved in Western Balkans, because as long as we are not able to integrate the Western Balkans, all other stakeholders, you know, whoever, will be heavily involved and will want to be heavily involved, and we can cry about it. So I think that reforms to be based on rationality, to be based on common sense, and the enlargement to be put on the top of the agenda and go as quick as it is just possible.
Thank you, Minister. We're still going to have to come back to the flip side of that, and the, you know, getting the EU fit for 35, as Minister Roswall wrote in your op-ed in the Bled Strategic Times. You just came through the experience of the EU presidency. Got hopefully a nice break after June 30th. I hope. But you spoke about, you know, hosting your colleagues, trying to get beyond just the necessity of reform as a common or growing consensus towards the content and the approach. What were your main takeaways, if you can go a little bit more into detail of those conversations? And then also as a part B, you're now out of the presidency. You're not just moderating in sort of a neutral way. How is Sweden positioning itself on those key questions around decision-making, budgetary reform, enlargement reform, and any other priority areas?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I know, Marko, I will not blame the weather on you, but it was really nice early this morning. I'm very glad. This is my first time here in Bled. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, I used the Fit for 55 sentence into Fit for 35. Of course, I hope there will be more than that. But EU sometimes have we have acronyms for a lot of things, and people, our citizens doesn't understand. So Fit for 55 is something that most of us now know what it is. And during the Swedish presidency, we worked very hard on making EU safer, greener, and freer, and we worked hard on closing the Fit for 55 package. Anyway. So I arranged this informal meeting starting in Uppsala and having a good intervention from Natalie Tocci and Alexander Stubb, and then we had very informal discussions in groups, and some of my colleagues here was attending. And the reason, I think, this is of all of us, we talked about it earlier, we need to be fit and ready, and that was very good. Not first, but a very good discussion form that I think that we had. My take from that meeting was that it's a very common view on that we need, it's not about if, it's about how. And we need to, this will not be easy, and also President Michel said that yesterday in his speech, this will not be easy for neither the candidate countries, but neither for the current member states. And we had discussions on difficult questions like decision making, of course, but also budgetary questions. And so I think that we are in the start, and I'm looking forward to the report and looking forward to the next step of the discussion. And I think it's very important also from the European Council's meetings that it's on the top on the leaders' agenda, and it's also very important that all member states are involved in these discussions. I think, from my point of view, it's very important that they focus on what EU is very good at. That is the single market. Rule of law is important, as Laurence, for example, mentioned. All these things that we have to focus on and mention. But then we also, and then maybe there's an opportunity for me to put out competitiveness, because that was one of the things that we, during the Swedish presidency, worked very hard for. Being a small country in the north, export and import dependent, we know that this is something that we need to work on. And you, Peter, put out the figures a little bit. So I'm very optimistic that we now are discussing it for real, and I think the only way forward is, well, it's just one way forward. We need to go there, and that was the common view from this informal General Affairs Council in Stockholm and Uppsala. You also asked me now, yes, I have rest some during the summer, but this, I think, so now Sweden is going out of the honest broker to being, not a member state, of course. And we have no different view than we had earlier. Sweden has always been a country that is working for enlargement, especially, as I said, we see that we are strong in single market trade and so forth, but we have a job to do, but this is our strength. We need to build on that, and that will be this, the Swedish point of view always. And I can say this with trust, because I think that also our former Foreign Minister Ann Linde is in the room. So this is something that we've been working for a long time, and this will be something that we will continue on, and we see the benefits of it, of course, for Swedes. But I also, lastly, I also want to point out something that President Michel said in his speech yesterday. This is something that we also need to talk with our citizens about. As I said, Fit for 55 was nothing, and nobody understood it for the first time. I didn't when I heard it, but now I know. We sometimes use words and in short words to things, and we need to have the discussion with our citizens on this move on the path forward.
How do we do it? If I can ask a quick follow-up question there. What are some of the instruments? I mean, we've had the conference on the future of Europe. There's some suggestions of follow-up there. What are other tools that you think we should be looking at on that citizen engagement?
I think the upcoming European Parliament election will be one of the forums that you can actually speak European politics with the citizens. But I also think that the momentum that also Laurence talked about is now, everybody see the new geopolitical situation and the security that we need to do. So I think among citizens, we all see the necessity of having enlargement for, so that I think that is a momentum that we need to take. But of course, we need to talk about it home and everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Western frontier of the European Union. How do we use that momentum to build on Mr. Roswall's point? And you've also spoken about the need of focusing on contents, less process and procedure. Can you expand on that? Even when we're talking decision making, there's contents to be discussed there. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, thank you. So first, I would like to thank Marko and Slovenia for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in the Bled Strategic Forum and to participate in this very important discussion on the reform of the European Union in order to prepare for the enlargement in particular. And I would like to express my solidarity to Slovenia for the recent floods and all the destruction they caused. So now going to your question, yes, we're at we're the western coast of Europe, and I convened recently, last May, a meeting of the Atlantic member states of the European Union, and I wanted to put this topic of the reform on the agenda of that meeting. So we had their first discussion on this, because at the time, this was not long ago, this was last May, there was not a lot of appetite to have this discussion. Since then, we've gone a long way. We've had this discussion already in Stockholm under the leadership of Jessika, the Swedish presidency, and it was very important at an informal setting to have this discussion among ministers for Europe. We'll keep on having this discussion during the Spanish presidency. Leaders will have a chance to discuss this in Granada at the informal European Council next month. And I believe that now it is a given that we need to reform in order to enlarge. But this wasn't so just 2 months ago or 3 months ago. So now, as we've heard President Michel say...
What do you think has changed in 2 or 3 months?
People started realizing that, indeed, we probably are not fit for 35, and so we need to create the conditions to make this enlargement happen. And this is now common sense, I would say. It's the conclusion. So going from the end to the beginning, I would say that this is the conclusion. We need to reform in order to enlarge. So now let's ask the questions that lead to this conclusion. I have 5 questions. First is why? Why do we need to reform? We need to reform because we know that sometimes it's already so difficult at 27. Now imagine doing things and deciding at 30-something. Just like President Macron yesterday said, we clearly need to create the conditions to be able to make decisions and function at 30-something member states. Then the second question is, what for? What do we need this reform for? And we need it not to create, this discussion should not be perceived as an obstacle to the enlargement, but rather on the contrary, as something that we need in order to create the conditions to have new members on board, to take in new members. So this is not putting obstacles on the way, this is rather a step towards enlargement. So the good news for the candidate countries is that you're not alone. It's not only you that have a heavy homework to do. We also, in the European Union, have a homework to do in reforming to create the absorption, so-called absorption capacity to prepare the enlargement. So it's not whether to enlarge or not, it's about preparing for the enlargement. Then the third question is, what do we reform, or what do we need to reform? And I would say that at least 3 things that are on the menu. We need to reform the European budget, because particularly if we consider some of the candidate countries, the impact of their entry into the European Union and into the European Union budget will be major. So we need a budgetary reform. We probably need some kind of reform in some of the major EU policies, like agriculture policy and cohesion policy. And we will need institutional reform on decision-making procedures and how we function. Then the fourth question is, when do we reform? And I would say ASAP, as soon as possible, and before the enlargement, in order to be ready for the enlargement. So we need to reform in order to create the conditions to then have new members coming in. And then the final, fifth question, the most difficult one, is how do we reform? And I don't have an answer to this one yet, because it's a given now that we need to reform, but we're not necessarily on the same page on how to do it. But I'm not able at the moment yet to say how we should reform, but I think I'm able to say how we should not go about doing this reform. And going to the issue that we were raising about content and procedure. We should not focus on procedure. We should focus our discussions on content. So we should not start having a discussion on treaty change. If we start saying, okay, we need treaty change, then that's a recipe for disaster. So maybe that will come at the end of the process. But now we need to discuss what we want for the future. We should not start discussing how many commissioners there will be or how many members, how many MEPs each new country will have, or what decisions should be taken by what majority. That also makes it much more difficult. So what we need to discuss is what governance model or what governance framework we want for a wider Europe. And we should have this discussion, I believe, based on three premises. That we need to discuss a governance model for Europe with more member states, with more diverse member states, and with member states that have different views on European integration, different perspectives, different aspirations for Europe and for the European Union in the future. And based on these three premises, we probably need to discuss a governance model which is more flexible and allows for some degree of, some level of differentiation in order to accommodate all the 30-something and all their different stances regarding the European Union. So I think that this is more or less what we need to start discussion, what this model is, a more flexible, more differentiated, elastic model for the European Union. And then we'll see how the procedure that we'll have to follow in order to get that model to work.
Thank you. I hope we can explore the how and not just the how not to a little bit more and, with everyone. Maybe I'll pose that question to you, Minister Grlić Radman. As someone from Croatia, the most recent EU member state to join, a success story, having just joined Schengen and the Eurozone. So what is your take, and specifically on the how to reform, not the how not to?
Thank you so much. You mentioned success story. But first of all, let me thank the organizer and my colleague Tanja Fajon for placing this relevant topic high on this year's agenda. And we had a discussion on this issue included in our Dubrovnik forum also in July, and we exchanged some views on the EU's ability to to learn the language of power and to adapt to the new geopolitical circumstances, however. But I also just wanted to briefly touch upon this title of the very important, the solidarity for global security, and having in mind that Croatia, we have been severely affected by the storms, floods, and while Slovenia was struck, Slovenians were struck as our neighbors and by disaster overwhelming proportions, and then who is going to help their immediate neighbor, and Croatia offers assistance and help, and we reacted swiftly. No country can prepare for just fully for these types of catastrophic events, and we need to act together, because floods, fire doesn't stop at the border. Solidarity is very, very, very important. But you mentioned the success story. It's your explanation that, okay, we are very proud to the fact that Croatia proved to be a success story. But Croatia, as a last country, was exposed to not only to the established criteria, but also benchmarks. It was the new family of the conditions. It was not easy. And we worked hard to fulfill all the necessary criteria and benchmarks, and it testifies that hard work does pay off. And looking back and having in mind Croatia right now, and it's not so our goal, foreign policy goal, was not the membership in the European Union. It was because of our society, because of our citizens, because of the rule of law, because of all the values we are going to share with, and we belong to the European family. I do remember as a diplomat, and I use every opportunity also to express my also gratitude to Hungary and who chaired in this very difficult time. It was the first half of 2011, and in this year also, thanks to the Hungary also, we finalized our negotiation. But of course, because not only, but Croatia fulfilled all the necessary and criteria and benchmarks. But as of 1st January this year, we also entered the Schengen zone. It was also not easy work, and we introduced an euro as a Croatian currency. And what remains? Okay, besides the OECD membership, we have already your support of the 38 countries. It remains the stability and institutional functionality of the Western Balkans. It's our immediate neighborhood, and who more than Croatia is interested to have in the Western Balkans in the European Union. And we are also, like Hungary, we are vocal proponent of the enlargement, however. But so the EU enlargement, from our point of view, should remain based on the individual approach and principle of own merits, and of course established criteria. But given the circumstances, Russian aggression against Ukraine, and so that led the European Union to speed up its decision making and to take bold geopolitical decisions. Something changed the whole situation and Europe. And never in the history we testify of how we can act unanimous, how we can reach a consensus, and nevertheless we don't have a majority and voting, there are qualified majority voting. First of all, we show that we are ready to cultivate the strategic culture when it comes decision for example, never in the history we helped in sending the lethal aid to Ukraine. And we found a common sense for that. That's good to join, to find a sense and of purpose, as we shown at the very beginning of Russian aggression towards Ukraine. And Croatia, really as a country who had a very, very difficult situation, and bearing in mind that the solution of former Yugoslavia was not easy work, and the tragedy, and we still are searching a missing person. However, it's overburden of the past. But in these 30 years, we succeed and to fulfill all the foreign policy goals, and like also to countries in the Western Balkans to do the same. As immediate neighborhoods, Bosnia and Herzegovina, we share the common border more than 1,000 kilometers. The specific multinational nature of Bosnia and Herzegovina is something that asks our support. You know, it's a country of two entities, three constituent people, Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. And we would like to see the Bosnia and Herzegovina as soon as possible to start with negotiations with the European Union, together with Slovenia and other countries, Hungary and others. So we are now supported to grant the candidate status in December last year for Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you, Minister. I'll come to you, Daniela. You're better than a German government representative because you can hopefully speak a bit more freely about the state of play of this debate in Berlin. And Minister Boone also mentioned your role on the expert group, the Franco-German working group. She didn't take my bait of previewing anything, so I will try with you, especially on the, as Secretary Antunes mentioned, on the how-to on decision-making, the much more complex question on the budget, agricultural policy. How are you thinking about some of these key areas on this working group, whatever you can give away already?
Well, thank you very much, Jens. And the fact is that Laurence is right. She can't give a preview because she doesn't know what's in the report. It is indeed an independent expert group, and I can't give you a preview because the work isn't finished. So I can still give you a few lines of thought. And some of the points are actually public because this working group was mandated by the two ministers for European Affairs, Laurence Boone and Anna Luhrmann. So a few basic things that were really formed the start of our work and the start of our reflection. The task of this group is to prepare the EU institutionally for enlargement. So we are supposed to look at the mechanics of decision-making and at the question of how can the EU be better in acting, be more capable of acting in a scenario where all the current candidate countries and maybe even a few more will be taken in. We are not looking into policies. That's clearly not our mandate, but it's very interesting to see how over the past month the debate has shifted, and very rightly so, because one is to make the system work, and the other one is to make the policies adjusted to the new situation of new and large members that are willing, or candidates that are willing to come in. Another thing has changed since we started in late January, and that is really the urgency of the debate. The fact that we are here on this panel together and every single minister has said that there is an urgency to also debate the EU side and not only the candidate side is a huge progress. And why is that so? Because I do believe that when we had our first discussions in January, that was just before the first anniversary of, or the first year after Russia's full-scale invasion or aggression towards Ukraine. And I think the recognition now in Europe is very broad that there is no easy solution to this war because there's a clear aggressor that denies one European neighboring country the right, or wants to deny it the right to exist. And that we have to respond to that politically, and enlargement is one of the answers, but of course there are other answers before Ukraine can be a full member of the EU. So policy has moved much more to the center, and not only the security dimension and the energy dimension, but also other areas. So already I do believe that something has changed, and that is the thinking of the EU 27, accession countries, pre-accession policies, and then full membership. So I think this notion of thinking more flexibly definitely has to apply to the EU internally when we have 27 or more members, but it also has to apply to our thinking of applying our policies to our neighbors in view of preparing them for accession, or even if they are neighbors who will not be members of the European Union. So one of the other changes that we have seen now is 2 meetings of the European political community, which basically brings together countries on eyes level, which is not so for most candidate countries, that they actually have the chance to speak with other European leaders beyond the negotiation situation. So I do think there's a really fundamental political recognition that the geopolitics on our continent have changed, and that there's a real threat. Now, given the sense of urgency, I wish to give a few, because you asked so clearly, a few sort of insights into our thinking about how reforms can be introduced. Of course, the short term matters a lot, right? And so we are looking into any reform that can be implemented and make sense for, the goals that I've named, for the EU to adopt with the current treaty base. And quite a lot can actually be done. If you look into the treaties, the composition of the Commission and other things, they are treaty bases that serve to think through how can the institutions and also the relationship between institutions be adjusted. And then there are accession treaties. Accession treaties can add to EU primary law if you introduce certain changes that are directly linked to the fact that new members are joining. So that is sort of the second step where there can be changes to primary law. But of course, we also ask ourselves, should we look at the big picture and what are other goals? But that is really beyond enlargement, I would say. That is a longer-term conversation if the EU wants to review its own functioning much more fundamentally. Now, as a personal comment, which I want to add on that notion of differentiation, I think this may lead us to a moment of truth, because eventually the differentiation is not only going to be countries are joining the EU but may not necessarily want to join all bits and pieces, so they might be less integrated. But at some point the political conversation has to happen. What is the actual core of the EU? Not only in terms of country names, but also what that core is defined by. And here the value space, the principles that are enshrined in the EU treaties come to play. Rule of law plays a big role in our discussions. We do look at the problems the EU is facing at the moment internally in implementing its own principles. And there is, of course, a huge question to be answered politically at some point. If that consensus within the EU is no longer given, then how do you deal with that? That has to happen before accession, because right now I think the treaties are very clear, right? And the EU, in its negotiations with candidates, projects those values and norms, rightly so. So part of our work indeed focuses on the question, what can be done to make it clearer and more effective to protect those principles within the legal and institutional framework of the EU as it is today. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniela, for somewhat of a preview, I think that was a good overview, and I appreciate that. I know you can't. We're all looking forward to the presentation later on in September. We have about 15 minutes to go. Get your questions ready. I do want to push Minister Boone on the how-to one more time, and especially on decision-making and the question of unanimity, qualified majority voting, and how you are thinking about that from Paris, and especially the element of the reservations of some member states, especially on the smaller member state side, about such a move into areas like common foreign and security policy, taxation, and other complex areas. So an easy one for you.
Thank you, I appreciate. So I also appreciate that you managed to make Daniela speak, and we get some sort of a preview here. I think there's one additional thing has shifted. So first, perhaps let me give you a bit of insight. The reason why France and Germany and many others the reason why we set up this group of experts was to start a discussion. It was to trigger the discussion across the EU. So Daniela and her co-worker started in January. Then we had a discussion in Brussels. Jessika, Tiago, Marko has always been very also eager, and now here, so Denmark. So this is spreading, and I think it's an important discussion we need to have, a political discussion, as Daniela was saying. So that in that sense, I think we've already achieved something, and that is very good. And then I'm looking forward to the option. The second thing which I think has shifted is the importance of the rule of law. Before you said rule of law and people started snoring. But really what we're talking about here, it's independence of justice, it's plurality and independence of media, it's the fight against corruption, it's the funding of political parties. It's just crucial. And this, and my colleagues may disagree or agree, but this has risen in importance. tremendously. And we're now putting that on top of the list. And I think that is something crucial because it comes to the discussion of the core that Daniela was mentioning. I mean, let's face it, we don't always agree, right? We don't. We do manage to find a consensus, but you're asking about qualified majority, you're asking about the defense policy or taxation. We do not want that, and Mariya mentioned it. Every country has the right to express itself, but we have an issue when one country is blocking everything. And we do have to address this issue. That's why we need to talk about this voting, or that's why the way we take a decision. But, and I think Tiago and Jessika mentioned it, why do they block, right? Why does one country feel the need of blocking? But that perhaps because they don't have the same vision of the European Union as the others. And if that's the case, if it's a different vision of policies, of what the EU is there for, then we need to have a discussion of policy, about policies. And very frankly, I think we will have it. We want to avoid it. We will have it very soon because not every country sees ever closer union. Not every country wants to be part of a core group. So, and in a way, I think Tiago mentioned differentiation. What do we mean when we talk about differentiation? We just mean simply that some countries want to do more things together and others do not. And these others who do not, it's perfectly respectable, but they should not block those who do want to do more things together. That's when we are going to have a very interesting discussion.
I assume not in the next 12 months altogether. Okay. Would love to have questions from the audience. Be short and concise, question marks at the end. We'll start with Natalie. There we go.
Natalie Tocci. I just wanted to come back to this issue of reform and rule of law as an element. Because on the one hand, the reason why we're having this enlargement conversation now, as opposed to pretending to have an enlargement conversation in previous years, right, is because the security strategic rationale is back. So we know that there is no alternative, or rather the alternative leads to terrible things, right? Now, if enlargement is going to happen, in a sense, there is a strategic rationale driving it, which is different from a transformative rationale driving enlargement. So there is a tension between transformation, or a potential tension between transformation and the security rationale. Because if it's going to happen anyway, then one could say, well, it would happen regardless of what those countries look internally. So how do you address that tension which is inbuilt in these two contrasting rationales to enlargement?
We'll take one more question from the colleague to your left, immediately here.
Thank you very much, Sabine Lange. I'd like to pick up on something from Ms. Gabriel, and you mentioned the fear of the member states. And it's quite clear to me that in order to go beyond, or we need to deconstruct those fears in order to surpass them and to come to anything in the future. So I was wondering if the panel could tell us your observations, your sense of the fear of, and especially off the table and on the table by the member states. Obviously not your own, but your observations of which fears are there. It's quite clear to me that the perspectives are very different, and if Mr. Szijjártó mentions that the enlargement could happen tomorrow, and I could see all your faces, clearly we have a variety of fears here, so I'd be very appreciative of that. Thank you.
All right, nothing like a little bit of fear. I think we're going to run to that question along the panel real quick as a closing, as we're running out of time. So starting with you, Secretary Štucin.
Thank you very much. And I'll try to answer both, but I would like to go back to what Tiago mentioned. And we have discussion, reform in order to enlarge, or reform and enlarge. We have this discussion basically every month because we sit together at the General Affairs Council, and that's one of the rare points where we don't agree. And I would also agree with Sabina that yes, when we come to the question of the enlargement and reform, there are fears that we need to definitely address. But one thing for me here is crucial. What Hungarian minister said, enlargement process is actually failed in the last decade. It was very successful 20 years ago with the big bang enlargement and Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia then, but then it suddenly didn't work anymore. And the last opening of the chapters was 2 years ago during our EU presidency with Serbia. Since then, actually nothing happened. There were political decisions, yes. We gave candidate status to Moldova, Ukraine, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, but there were no very concrete steps. And in order to overcome those fears, especially regarding the enlargement, we have to prove that it works. And we have to prove very concretely that it works. So I don't know if this, perhaps it was mentioned, opening all the chapters, perhaps, I don't know. I mean, we need some new ideas to put on the table. We need to be innovative. Because, why? Because we need Western Balkan countries as much as they need us. And I think we realized this over the last year. We knew this, many of us knew this before, but I think everybody knows this now. So we should act, as I said at the beginning, we have a window of opportunity now. I think we should avoid big discussions and just start working on these processes.
Thank you. Very short, Minister Boone, and we can work down the line, 1-minute answers.
So I will pick up on the tensions between security and enlargement. I don't think there's a tension. I think we need to have a big European Union, an enlarged European Union for the security of the continent. But I don't think that European Union will be the European Union we'll have today. We will have to see where we put cohesion, agriculture, other policies, the reconstruction of Ukraine, which part of it. And for that, we will need to move away from a petty budgetary policy that is very national with rules to protect the money, to something that is actually designed to support the objective of the enlarged EU and perhaps of a core group of EU who wants to go into more integration. So no tension, but we need to work on a vision of the EU.
Daniela.
Yes, one additional point on that. I emphasized what has happened beyond the EU accession process in terms of stabilizing countries and relationships on our continent. And I think that is key as long as the EU has not gone through that process. Because at some point, the question will be, what is then the EU? And if you say the EU, or Natalie, I mean in that conversation, the EU may not be the EU we know today, then who owns the treaty core? Where is that base of a mutual primary law that has values and principles enshrined in it, and to whom does it apply? I think that will be the most crucial question, and at the end of the day, this is where member states all have to make their choice, and candidate countries as well. So which part do they integrate into? One point on the fears. So interestingly, our group was created on Franco-German initiative, and the composition is Franco-German, but our work has been trans-European from the start, because our own group meetings were very often enriched by guests we had. And in the beginning, we invited the guests, and as we got, as the political situation changed, as we discussed, more and more people wanted to speak with us and wanted to share their views, experts, decision makers, former decision makers. So we had a really European conversation throughout the month. Now, the fears that came up, in particular, sometimes from smaller member states, was really, if the EU grows and decision making is made more efficient, how can we protect our national interest? Where are we? And this is not a comment on the work of the group in terms of recommendation, but just issues that were raised to us was composition of the commission, will we have a commissioner, should we? And of course, every country wants a commissioner. Then the question of qualified majority voting, who can be overruled under which conditions? And how can safeguards be built into the process to protect core interests? So questions like this came up, and I think they partially respond maybe to your question. The other set of concerns was indeed if we enlarge too quickly, given our own internal fragilities, is there a risk that enlargement hollows out the union based on rule of law and democracy? So those, I would say, were the big topics that came up in conversations.
Thank you, Daniela. Minister,
so it's
maybe pick one.
Yeah, it's evident that so we have to invest in enlargement, and we have to spread the space of freedom and security in the area of standards and values. But first of all, having in mind the situation and with Russia, and alignment with the common foreign security policy, including the sanctions against Russia, has become increasingly important.
Minister Szijjártó, your key concerns.
Well, our understanding is crystal clear. Nowadays, because of our shape, the European Union needs the Western Balkan more than the Western Balkan would need the European membership. So we have to be quick, and we have to give priority. We have to give priority to enlargement, and we are not doing very well because we have not been able to let Bulgaria and Romania join the Schengen area either, which is a shame, I have to tell you.
Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister Gabriel, your key concerns as you look at this process.
Well, first about the fears and tensions, maybe two things: not to create expectations that will easily become disappointment, and second, have the same conditions applied to all. And the example was just exactly said. What about the accession of Bulgaria and Romania to Schengen? There is a technical criteria. The European Commission said it for many years. It's really time now to advance and to show that the same criteria are applied to all. But when we talk about the fears, I think that we have just to simply to insist on from, through, for. We want to protect our citizens from what? Instability, unpredictability, dependence, influence. We have to address, we have to name these fears. Second, we want to address them through what? Policies, budget, legislation, and here I have a personal point of view. EU should stop to be only regulatory power, should be innovative power. And third, for strategic goals. That was one of the main issues here. We want to protect the interests of our citizens, and we want to be ready to adapt in a very fast changing world. And that's our strategic autonomy, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to add plus one for what Tiago said about the institutional treaty reforms. That was one of the fears in Sweden. And so I was very glad that the discussions in Stockholm was more or less, everybody agreed, so, well, focused. So that is one, and the tensions is very different. Of course, I know all about the tensions in Sweden and among Swedes. And they're similar in other countries. But I think that is why I think we need to focus on what the EU is best on. For example, as I said, single market, the rule of law, and we need to focus on that because it's in a hurry.
Thank you. 15 seconds, otherwise I'm in big trouble.
Very quickly, just on Natalie's question, yes, I would say that maybe the trigger for the sense of urgency on enlargement and on reform was the whole security issue. But then when you start discussing it, you realize that we need to transform in a whole range of issues. And there, the more transformative dynamic comes in, because you do realize that in order to take on board more members, there's lots of things that you need to transform and need to be serious about reform. It's just not, some twists here or there. It's really about a transformative approach.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate our panelists' discipline, insight, and contributions. We've run out of time. I hope we made a small contribution to the debate and moving the ball forward ever so slowly. Lots of big decisions coming up this fall, and thank you again for joining us. We'll follow this space, and if the audience could give the panel a round of applause, please.